Hello, Star Trek fans, and welcome to the Rebinge Deep Space Nine podcast. My name is Kim.
And my name is James.
And we're watching Star Trek Deep Space Nine from the beginning, one episode at a time. Welcome back to the podcast. Today we are on Season 4, Episode 2, The Visitor. This episode first aired October 9th, 1995. Before we talk about this, anything to say about The Way of the Warrior, Part 2?
No, it was perfect.
It was a really long recording, but it might have been all the airplanes that kept interrupting us. We just talked for a long time, too, though.
Yes, we did. It was a great start to the season.
Yeah, except for Kira's hair, everything was off to a good start.
Well, and you criticized Miles' hair as well.
Yeah, Miles' hair didn't look great. Well, he's barely in this episode, so I won't pick on his hair in this one.
Oh, okay, that's good.
Well, should we start talking about the saddest episode in Star Trek history?
Yeah. For me, this is definitely the saddest episode in all of Star Trek.
I'm not sure I've cried more watching a television show. I don't know that I could come up with one that made me cry more than this one. So yeah, there's a lot of tears in this episode.
Impressive that a show that I first watched 30 years ago, I can come back to and it still kills me.
I can see why. Well, in the cold open, we're in a house and a thunderstorm is raging outside of the window. We see a happy picture of Jake and Sisko together, and then we see a hand pick up a baseball from the desk briefly, then put it back on its stand. And then the hand takes a small hypo spray out of a box and uses it on his neck, and we see an older guy. And at this point, I assumed it was Sisko, not Jake. But when the doorbell rings, revealing a young woman, we learn that this is in fact Jake. The visitor is fanboying over Jake Sisko, the writer. She also wants to be a writer, and Jake is her favorite author. Old Jake fixes a scratch on her head, puts a blanket over her, gets her some tea.
It was a very stormy night out there.
Yeah, so she's damp from the rain and hurt herself on a tree branch. He says some ominous things about how when you get old, you think about things like, today might be the last time you sit in your favorite chair, or watch the rain fall. She wants to know why Jake only wrote 2 books and why he stopped when he was so young. He makes some jokes, but he eventually says if she'd come on any other day, he wouldn't talk about it. But since she came today, of all days, it seems like the right time to tell the story.
He lost his pen, apparently.
Yeah, that was his little joke. Then he tells her that it all started a long time ago when he was just 18, and the worst thing that could happen to someone happened to him. His father died. And they're already killing us as we cue the theme song.
Yeah, that was a... Wait, what?
Yeah, we're off to a terrible start. And this was the first time I cried. So cry number 1 in my notes. After the theme song, old Jake tells the visitor that he and his father were very close, which I think we all knew.
Yes.
Especially after the loss of his mother. The visitor had read that Jake had stopped writing so he could conduct scientific research. Jake says it's not quite that simple. He says just before his father died, he was working night and day on a short story, but he wasn't making any progress, and it was making him miserable. His dad saw that he needed a break and insisted that he go with him to the Gamma Quadrant to watch the wormhole undergo a subspace inversion.
Apparently these things only happen every 50 years.
Now we go to the station in the time that we're used to, and Jake is writing something on a pad when Sisko comes in saying, "Jaco, let's go." And this is already, for me, cry number 2, because it's the kind of thing that your dad would call you that maybe nobody else would.
Yeah.
Like my dad would call me Kimbo, which nobody else ever did. My brother every now and then, but nobody outside of the family. And so, yeah, this was cry number 2 already, and we're at 7 minutes and 50 seconds.
Wow.
I'm telling you, this episode killed me. Once we're on the Defiant, Jake is still working on his pad and his story, hiding out in his quarters. Sisko says the subspace inversion thing only happens once every 50 years, and he's not going to forgive himself if he misses it. Sisko tells him that as a writer, he needs to poke his head up every now and then and look around, or he'll miss his own life. So he finally convinces him to come up to the bridge for a while, and he says afterwards he'll read his story and then they can talk about it. I mean, he's Father of the Year, this guy. He's just making it worse.
He really is. Also, I think here in this opening with Jake, you see a theme that'll be through the rest of this episode, that Jake is slightly obsessive, not necessarily in a good way.
Yeah, he hasn't quite learned that lesson that you need to poke your head up every now and then or your life passes you by, but we learn it by the end.
Yes. But I think this intro is hinting at the start of it.
But I actually think there's a part where he's not obsessed enough.
Interesting.
Which we'll talk about.
Yeah.
Well, before they leave Jake's quarters, something rocks the ship. From the bridge, Dax says the wormhole's gravimetric field is surging, and the power output from the warp core has jumped off the scale. Nobody in engineering is responding, so Sisko tells Jake to stay put, and he heads to engineering. But Jake doesn't stay put. The voiceover of old Jake says most of the time he knew enough to do what his father told him, but for some reason he followed his dad that day. Once in engineering, we see that all of the engineers are unconscious or dead. Dax calls saying that the warp coils are locked in a feedback loop and Sisko needs to realign them or the core is going to blow. At this point, Sisko sees that Jake has followed him into engineering, and as smoke builds around them and the ship is rocked dramatically, he tells Jake to find him an interface compensator. He eventually finds it in the hands of one of the dead or passed out engineers, and he hands it to his dad.
There's NPCs lying all over the place.
There really are. So his dad plugs it in and starts messing with a panel. He's trying to shunt the excess power out through the deflector array. There are some electric pulses around the warp core, and eventually everything calms down and Sisko smiles. He removes the tool from the panel and hands it to Jake. As he does that, an electrical impulse shoots from the warp core into Sisko, passing through the tool into Jake. And Jake falls to the floor, and he watches his dad continue to get hit by the electrical impulses, and then just kind of disappear.
Fades out.
"No!" Jake shouts, and the old Jake voiceover says, "He was gone."
He just faded away.
Cry number 3. Yes, I kept count through this whole episode.
Another moment in the show, which was how are they going to get Sisko back?
Yep. We go back to the house, and the visitor says she isn't sure she could have gotten over losing someone like that right in front of her eyes. Old Jake says people do. Time passes, they realize the person they lost is really gone, and they heal. But that's not what happened to him. Then they show the promenade packed with people for Sisko's memorial. Cry number 4. I actually had to stop here for a while at this point because what are you doing to me, Star Trek?
Yes.
Old Jake says people came forward to talk about his father and what they remembered most about him. It looks like Worf had spoken, but we don't hear him. And then Kira goes up next, and she says that Sisko was more than her commanding officer. He was the emissary to her people sent by the prophets. But she says, most importantly, he was my friend. As the camera pans around, it shows Odo and Miles looking just forlorn.
Yeah.
The look on Miles' face absolutely killed me here. It looked like he was just holding tears back so hard. That was cry number 5.
Oh.
I mean, that look really hurt.
Colm Meaney is a master of the expression.
Oh, he's so good. I mean, he didn't even say anything.
Yeah.
And it made me cry. It was terrible.
It looked so believable.
Oh, completely. I've seen that look on people's faces, at my dad's funeral. It's just awful. I'm sure I've had that look on my face. They also show Quark, Bashir, and Nog looking very grim. Morin is there too, but he has the same expression on his rubber face that he always has.
Not known for his expressions.
No. And then it passes by a sad Dax, and it lands on a teary Jake. Old Jake is saying that he couldn't step forward. No matter what he would have said about his dad, it wouldn't have been enough.
Poor Jake.
Ugh. Old Jake says everyone went out of their way to look after him after that, especially Dax, but he never felt so alone in his life. They show Dax comforting him. Old Jake says that after a few months, things started to return to normal for everyone else. In the bar, Nog is trying to be a friend to Jake, and even Quark is being nice to him. And his just inability to enjoy anything brought cry number 6. Oh.
He's clearly very depressed.
Yes.
And is still suffering from the grief.
Yes, and he's just stuck.
Yeah.
That's the thing I think that becomes so hard from here is he just doesn't even know what to do.
Yeah.
Well, then Jake and Nog are coming out of a holosuite, and Jake just seems despondent and depressed. He's not really enjoying anything, even though Nog is trying so hard. Nog asks him what his plans for the future are, since Nog is leaving for the academy soon, and Jake is considering taking the deferred admission into Pennington, but he's not sure. Nog is being very nice, and he's trying to be supportive, but he's not sure of the right thing to say to his friend. It's just heartbreaking and bleak.
I think this shows a real progression in Nog, that Nog has reached a point that he can actually empathize with Jake, which to me seems like a very un-Ferengi thing.
Yeah, Nog is definitely evolving. I'm not sure he knows how to deal with females yet, but you can certainly see him grow. I do think he had a special respect for Sisko, and maybe even for what he meant as a father to Jake. So I think he's tied up a little bit more in this than maybe he would be if it had happened to someone else.
Oh, that's true. You've brought that up before. Seems to have a reverence for Sisko.
Yeah, in the camping episode, you can see it's really important to him that Sisko likes him.
Yeah.
That's not true of anybody else. Like, he doesn't seem to care if Miles likes him, for example.
Right.
But he really looks up to Sisko. And maybe because he hears so many things about him from Jake. And also we established that he wasn't very proud of his own father. That's one of the reasons why he decided to go into Starfleet. So
Right.
if you look at it that way, he's a father figure to him.
Oh, I would agree with that. Yeah, and Sisko, to a large extent, is almost an embodiment of positives
Yes.
compared to both the male figures in his life.
Oh, definitely. Later, Jake is tossing and turning in his bed when there is an electrical charge that wakes him up, and he sees his dad sitting on the floor in front of him. And Sisko says, "Jake, what happened?" And then he cruelly disappears.
Oh,
Dramatic music plays as Jake is very confused.
yeah.
We go back to the house, and old Jake says Dax scanned the room but didn't find anything, suggesting maybe he just had a nightmare. So he just tried to forget about it, and he puttered around the station for the next 8 or 9 months. I mean, really? Come on, Star Trek. I mean,
They have to do that for the story.
well, but after all the crazy stuff that has happened to them, they're just not going to take this seriously?
Well, they take the things seriously that they need to progress the story.
I guess so, but I think about, like, Rumpelstiltskin, all the stuff that happened in Fascination.
Move along home.
Yeah, and this we don't think really happened. Oh, that was disappointing.
I'm disappointed in you, Dax.
Yeah, but I get it. She did a scan and didn't find anything, but still. At this point, Nog has left for Starfleet Academy, and Jake is basically moping around the station playing Domjot. Their crew is worried about him, but before long, they were more worried about rising tensions with the Klingons. When Sisko died, the Bajorans took it as a sign from the prophets that the Federation wouldn't be able to protect them from the Klingons, so Bajor entered into a mutual defense pact with the Cardassians, irritating the Klingons, so the station's civilian population started leaving the station.
That's an interesting turn of events right there.
It really is.
I guess if you're a deeply religious people, the death of someone who is such an icon would have implications in the broader political and social scheme of things.
Yeah.
Are the choices that you're making correct?
Yeah, you start questioning everything.
Yeah. So you can look at it as Sisko, as just one man, has an outsized influence on the politics of an entire sector.
Well, because to the Bajorans, he's not a man. He's the emissary. He's a religious icon.
True.
And that makes you look at him much differently and would make you react to him much differently.
Yeah.
I imagine in a similar way to when Kaiopaka died or when she was abandoned on that moon,
Moon of Idiots.
that had a similar impact on people. It was just so devastating to some that it probably made them make some big decisions that maybe they wouldn't have made otherwise.
Well, that was really punishment for betraying her son.
Well, that's how she took it, I would imagine. That she took that as her own sort of martyrdom.
Oh.
It seems really strange to me that they would make a pact with the Cardassians and not with the Klingons.
Maybe they don't see the Klingons as trustworthy because the emissary fought against the Klingons.
Oh, so, okay. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, do you go back to your captors, to your overlords?
Well, they have a peace treaty now, and remember, Cardassia, the military's effectively collapsed, so they have a civilian government.
That's true, they have a new government.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good point.
In this timeline, Cardassia might be a very different place very quickly.
Maybe. We're only a year later, but yes, it's possible. I mean, I think we've seen all around the world when a government changes that things can change pretty quickly.
Right.
So Jake is wandering around the station. He's still watching ships leave as a hobby, like he did when he was just a child. I found that really interesting. Another example of how stuck he is.
I think he was clinging to the positives from childhood because he's unable to process what's happened.
Yeah, like a security blanket.
Yeah, precisely.
Worf tells him that he should be on one of the ships that's leaving, but he asks Kira if he has to leave, and she says no, which irritates Worf a little.
On a positive note, Kira finally got the senior job she always wanted.
That's true. And she also got a new uniform.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that a little more later. Well, later, Kira talks to Jake privately. She knows that his grandfather wanted Jake to come back to Earth. She says the sector is on the brink of war, and she'd like to see him leave the station, but he begs her not to make him leave, which was cry number 7 for me.
Yeah.
He says the station is his home. It was like an abandoned shell when they first arrived, but his dad turned it into something, and everywhere he looks, he sees a part of him. He says if he leaves, he won't have anything left of his dad.
That's why he wants to stay.
Ay. Kira grabs his face and touches her forehead to his very sweetly. She tells him he can stay for now, but if a time comes where she says he has to go, he has to go. He nods, okay. I don't want to call this cry number 8 because this was still cry number 7, never stopped.
Oh my goodness.
Oy, this scene was so hard.
Oh yeah. Well, Sirac Lofton's acting in this is outstanding. He makes it so believable.
I read a story that his aunt had just died before they filmed this.
Yeah.
And that he was probably just able to sort of draw on reality in the moment. And I mean, which is terrible. But yeah, he's very realistic throughout this whole episode.
And the Nana visitor is a master of the emotion on screen.
Oy, yeah, that was tough. When she put her forehead on his, I was just like, oh, come on.
Well, you can see how it's somebody who is very important to both of them.
Yes. And she recognizes that he's stuck.
Yeah.
But she's also like, you got to get out of here at some point. You can't stay forever.
Yep.
But she's not going to force him to do it, which to some degree, these adults on this station, they should probably be pushing him off. But I can understand why they don't.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Worf would have put him on a ship. And said, see ya.
But the Klingon perspective on death is so radically different.
Yeah,
their mythology and their view of the world is Sisko as someone who was honorable, was a warrior, did his duty. His place in Sto-vo-kor is guaranteed.
And also, he had to, as a child, move on without his parents.
Yeah.
And he had to leave his home. Kira, though, too, she had to deal with her parents' deaths under pretty terrible circumstances. Yeah. That's why I do believe that she would have eventually forced him to go. Right. She just wasn't ready to do it yet or didn't think she needed to do it yet.
Maybe it's because she didn't have anyone to be there when her parents died.
Maybe.
You know, she is compensating for something she never had as a kid and giving Jake the opportunity.
That makes sense.
But something you've mentioned more than once, they really need a counselor on this station.
Oh, yes. Because none of these people are equipped based on their histories.
Exactly.
It sounds like Dax was trying, but mostly I think she was just trying to step up in her friend's absence. So I think she was doing this for Ben.
Right. I see what you mean.
Well, later, Jake is wandering the halls of the station when he sees the electrical charges again. And there's Sisko sitting on the floor again in the same position. Jake runs up to him and grabs his hand, realizing it's not a dream. But in a voiceover, the old Jake says something was wrong. In the infirmary, Dax, Miles, and Bashir are all there trying to figure out what's going on. They think that the accident knocked Sisko's temporal signature out of phase. He was pulled into subspace, and if they can't realign his temporal signature, he'll be pulled back. They start working on a containment field. Sisko says he remembers being in engineering on the Defiant like it was just a few minutes ago. But Jake tells him it's been over a year. And Sisko kind of goes into dad mode and he asks Jake how he's doing. And Jake isn't even able to answer because he's missed his dad so much. This one wasn't fair. This is cry number 8.
Yeah. That was a hard scene.
Even reading my notes when I went back through to edit, I cried. I mean, the look on his face.
Yeah.
And Sisko takes his head in his hands and kisses him. It's all right, he says. Everything is going to be all right. Oh, my goodness. Jake is despondent that when he saw him before, he didn't believe that he was alive.
Right.
It's okay, Sisko says. I'm here now. That's what matters. And then he starts to phase away again, and Jake starts to sob. And Sisko touches his face, saying, look at me. I need to know you're going to be all right. They pull Jake away from him and activate a containment field, but it doesn't matter. Sisko disappears anyway. And then Jake's crying face morphs into the old Jake.
So to make it worse, Jake's losing him multiple times.
Oh my God. Old Jake said he didn't think anything could be worse than losing his dad the first time until he was standing there staring at that empty bed, knowing he was alive, but trapped somewhere outside of time. The visitor girl says she can come back another time, but old Jake says there won't be any other time because he's dying. But after the ad break, he backpedals a bit on that, saying someone of his age is only accepting the inevitable. Then he says Dax and O'Brien tried for months to locate Sisko to no avail. Eventually, the situation with the Klingons got worse, and the Federation decided to turn over control of the station to the Klingon Empire. There was nothing more he could do, and he had to leave the station and give up whatever hope there was of seeing his father again. And in this scene, they did a callback to the very first episode of the show.
Yes.
Here, Jake is looking at the station from the window of the shuttle, just as Sisko did when they flew away from the ship where his wife died in Season 1, Episode 1.
That was a very nice cinematic touch. It's fascinating that the Klingons are the ones taking over the station. That Starfleet allows them to do that because it's a Bajoran station.
Yeah.
In the Bajoran system.
I thought that too. in the show, it said, like, the Federation turned it over to the Klingons. It's like, why were they even able to do that? Is it not in Bajoran's base?
Yeah.
I thought that was strange. I wonder if they came to some kind of agreement with them.
Yeah.
Some kind of treaty.
With the Bajorans and the Klingons and... Oh,
yeah.
That's a good point.
And just said, okay, here, you can have this station.
Yeah.
You can keep your eye on the wormhole.
That would be a good explanation, yeah.
They don't go into a lot of detail. They got too many other things going on.
You got to work on all the headcanon here.
Yeah. Well, Jake was left with no choice but to try and get on with his life from this point. He went to Earth and did eventually go to Pennington. After that, he settled in Louisiana to be near his grandfather and his restaurant. He wrote his first book, Anslum, and little by little, he started thinking less about the past. After a while, he met a woman and got married, and for a while, he was happy. This, to me, is maybe the hardest part to believe. Now that he knows he's alive and stuck in subspace, I don't know how you just go on from there. I mean, time passes and you have to, I suppose, but I don't see how you're not stuck in that moment.
Well, I think we come on to that.
Yeah, it bothers him later, yeah.
It might be a little out of sight, out of mind.
I think as the father, Sisko would expect him to.
Yeah.
Well, now we jump to a time when Jake Sisko is maybe in his mid-30s, and he's married and living in the same house, and Nog has arrived for a visit, and he's in a full red Starfleet uniform with 3 pips on his collar.
Lieutenant Commander?
She does say he'll be captain before he's 40, but I don't think she says his rank.
I'm going to have to look up what rank that is now.
Well, it's a commander for sure, because that's like what Riker had, was 3 pips.
Oh, he's a lot smaller than Riker.
Yeah, he's like half Riker's size. Jake's wife jokingly asks if he's going to ask her to chew his food for her, and Nog laughs, saying he has to admit that he's been more popular with women since he stopped asking them to do that. That was a nice moment of levity in an otherwise wrenching episode.
Yes, because Jake replies, I told you to stop doing that 25 years ago.
He says, I'm a slow learner. I think they did this just to show that Jake's wife knew about that.
Yeah.
She knew Nog as well and that there had been a lot of contact between them. I think it was important to establish that friendship was still real and still going on.
Yeah, and it well established that Jake was happy, he was stable, that his friend was there, that he had basically moved on from the tragedy of his youth.
Oh, yeah, for sure. This is that happy time in his life, and yeah, they're putting it on full display.
Right.
And Nog, who seems to have developed some kind of an accent, tells adult Jake that the Klingons are allowing Starfleet to send an expedition through the wormhole and test the waters in the Gamma Quadrant to find out how the Dominion would react to ships coming through again. So I guess we're supposed to believe that the Klingons have held off the Dominion after all this time, even though we knew the changelings were everywhere way back then. But I get it. That's not what we're covering in this episode.
Well, I get the impression that the Klingons basically sealed off the wormhole. Nothing in, nothing out.
Well, that's probably a good idea at this point.
Well, we've seen their level of paranoia, so...
Yes, we have. Nog says the station is a bit run down now, and Morn owns the bar. Quark finally got the moon that he wanted, and Rom is helping him keep it in orbit. Why does he want a moon? What... Does he make it a big casino or something? I've never understood why he thinks he wants a moon.
Well, he's always been obsessed about it because his cousin has one. I expect it's something that gets rubbed in his face of, oh, your cousin has a moon.
Yeah, I suppose. Well, then Jake's wife brings out some champagne, and Nog toasts Jake for winning the Beitar Prize for his collected stories.
So he's a successful novelist. Yeah. Impressive.
Everyone here seems dangerously happy. Back in the future, old Jake drops his cup of tea and appears to be in distress, but he convinces the visitor that he's okay. He continues with the story, saying that later that night, after Nog had left, he was working on his new novel. His wife comes down to convince him to come to bed, and as they're walking together, the familiar electricity crackle happens again, and Sisko appears in Jake's living room, sitting in the same position. He's confused by how much older his son is. I mean, it's a whole different actor.
It is. And he's confused at why Worf's brother is impersonating Jake.
Oh, yeah, that's true. He does play Worf's brother. Jake introduces his wife, Karena, to his dad, and Sisko almost immediately asks if he has any grandchildren. Not yet, Jake says, with a really happy look on his face. Sisko tells Jake to tell him everything. He doesn't want to waste what little time they have. His wife hands him Jake's books, which makes him so happy. But Jake then starts to cry, and his wife steps away, leaving him with his dad. Cry number 9.
It brings it right back.
And again, oh my God, that look on the guy's face when he starts to cry is so real.
Yeah.
Jake apologizes for giving up on his dad. And Sisko says no one could be expected to hold out hope this long. But Jake says he should have kept trying to find him. Sisko tells him he's proud of what he's accomplished, having a wife and a career. And he says he wants grandchildren, even though he's not going to be around much. And then he flashes that big Sisko smile before suddenly disappearing.
Oh, this is so hard.
Oh my God. Cry number 10. Ugh.
Yeah, this is really written as a tearjerker.
Yeah. I didn't like the wording here of Jake saying, now that I know you're still out there. I mean, we always knew he was still out there, but I guess the thing that he's learned that's different is that he's somehow connected to Jake, but not to the wormhole or to the station.
Right.
But they should have known that when he reappeared on the station.
I don't think they did. I assume it's because it's close to the wormhole, so...
I mean, I get the point. This must be horrible. He finally finds happiness, and now he feels guilty about having it. I mean, oh my God.
I think that's a big part of this. Jake has guilt about the whole situation.
Yes.
He's not doing enough to rescue his father.
Yep.
And Sisko's appearance has brought that back. Or started it. I'm not sure which.
I don't know how he could even sleep at night.
Well, I would say that about Picard.
Not quite the same thing. Now, old Jake tells the visitor he consulted with Dax, and they realize that the accident must have created some sort of subspace link between the two of them. They also figured out the pattern of his dad's appearances, which seems to be governed by fluctuations in the wormhole's subspace field.
So even though they're on Earth, which is a long way from the wormhole, its fluctuations are affecting Sisko.
Yeah, somehow.
I have some theories about this I will talk about later.
It's all the subspace relays. Dax's calculations showed that the next time Sisko would appear, Jake would be an old man, so he decided to put aside his novel and devote himself to saving his dad.
Uh-oh.
So at the age of 37, he went back to school to study subspace mechanics.
Interestingly, Carl Urban was around that age in the Kelvin universe when he played Bones going to join Starfleet.
Oh, Well, old Jake says, at first, Karenna was patient, but he got so caught up in work, he didn't even notice that he was losing her. By the time he had entered the doctoral program, his marriage was over. Years later, he figured out a way to recreate the accident and was ready when the wormhole was about to have another inversion cycle. This would be the only chance for 50 years, so Nog, who was a captain by this time, helped by getting the Defiant pulled out of mothballs. And now, everyone is very old. Nog looks like Ishka. Bashir and Dax are little old people tottering around the Defiant.
Yes.
They see the station on the main viewer, but that's not their destination. At one point, old Dax makes fun of old Bashir for prattling on about his latest paper or his new backhand or his kid's science project. Why would Bashir, who must be around 80, why would he have kids doing science projects? I mean, maybe grandkids. The whole thing was weird.
Bashir's on his sixth marriage by this point.
That is possible. At the wormhole, they're waiting for it to invert and emit a gravimetric wave like it did last time. Jake has modulated the shields to channel that wave into a new subspace flux isolator that he designed.
So he's really taken to the science side of things.
Well, I imagine he went into it just looking for one thing, so he was probably quite focused. He didn't seem to have a knack for it when he was younger. I guess this feeds that narrative of if you just put your mind to something, you can do it. I'm not sure I always believe that, but... Finally, the electrical charge starts happening, and Sisko appears slowly. It starts to envelop Jake, too, and now they're both pulled into subspace. Sisko tries talking to Jake, asking how long it's been. Jake says 14 years, but he keeps trying to call Dax, and he tells Sisko they're trying to rescue him. Sisko says, "You're older than I am." As he tries to talk to him, Jake just keeps trying to call Dax and kind of ignoring Sisko. He asks about grandchildren, but Jake says Karenna left him. He asks about his writing, but Jake gets distracted by calling Dax again. He says, "This is the last chance I'll ever have to help you." And Sisko says, "Let go. If you won't do it for yourself, do it for me. Promise me. There's still time to make a better life for yourself. Promise me," he shouts. But Jake disappears from the subspace fragment and reappears back on the Defiant, crying again.
And without Sisko.
Cry number 1,000,000 for me.
I love Bashir's optimism. When we get Captain Sisko back, we can stop by Morns. It's not usual in Star Trek that you go through all these steps and it doesn't work.
Yeah, they're used to winning. If most of their missions like this failed, this would be a very different show. Would we watch it? Probably not.
The other thing is that Sisko is seeing the obsession in Jake.
Oh, yes.
That seems to really concern him.
They were really making a point of that, that he wasn't even interested in like hugging his dad or engaging in a conversation. He kept calling Dax because he had a one-track mind, and that was to save Sisko, which is good, I guess. You need that. But Sisko was like, you're wasting your time. You're doing that thing where you're not looking up to see the life around you.
Right.
But when he did it, he got punished for it. So this is just the most tragic story.
That's an interesting way to look at it.
Yes.
But yeah, it's the second instance of that obsession.
Yes, for sure.
I do really like Jake's Starfleet badge, though.
Oh, yeah, it's cool. Yeah, futuristic.
Yeah. And the final thing is, it's good to see that Morns is still open.
Yeah, with Klingons. Back to old Jake in his house, and now the sun has come up, so I guess they've been chatting all night. He tells the visitor he decided to honor his dad's request by writing again, and he has a new collection of stories. He lets her have the copy on the desk with his handwritten notes.
Because she is an aspiring writer.
Yes. He spent months trying to figure out what went wrong on the Defiant, and eventually he figured out that his dad was frozen in time at the moment of the accident, and the link between them was like an elastic cord. Every so often the cord would go taut enough to pull him forward into Jake's time, but only for a few minutes. He said he realized that if he died, that cord would go slack, and his dad would be lost in subspace forever. But if he could cut the cord when the link was at its strongest, meaning while they were together, he'd return to the moment of the accident. The visitor seems to understand what Jake is saying and decides to leave. Old Jake tells her that while she's studying his stories, she should poke her head up every once in a while and look around. Don't miss your life, Melanie, which apparently is her name.
And he tells her it was a pleasure to meet her.
Yeah, she thanks him and kisses his cheek before she leaves.
So Jake's figured out that his father is basically tethered to him in subspace.
Yep.
So that would really feed his guilt.
Yes.
Wow.
Now he feels responsible for all of it.
I feel bad for Jake because it just keeps on getting worse and worse for him.
I know. Old Jake grabs his dad's baseball and a copy of his new stories, and he sits down in his favorite chair. Later, he's asleep in his chair when his dad wakes him up. Jake says he's been expecting him. Sisko is glad to see he's still in the same house. He said, "You seemed happy here." And he sees that Jake got back to writing. Jake tells him to read the dedication, which of course says, "To my father, who's coming home." Sisko doesn't understand what it means. Old Jake, crying at this point, says, "It was me. It was me all along that's been dragging you through time like an anchor." Sisko finds the hypo spray and he's like, "No." But Jake says when he dies, his dad will go back to where this all began. Just remember to dodge the energy discharge from the warp core.
Duck this time.
Sisko pleads with him not to do it, but Jake says, "We have to be together when I die." And Sisko is like, "You shouldn't do this for me." But Jake isn't doing it just for Sisko. He's also doing it for the boy that he was all those years ago.
Jake tells Sisko, the boy needs you more than you know.
Yep. He says, "Don't you see? We're going to get a second chance." And then he starts to fade. And Sisko says, "My sweet boy," and he takes his head in his hand. Ugh. How many times have I called him Sweet Jake?
Yes.
Cry, 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 cry. Oh my God.
This was the toughest part of the show for me.
This was really hard. But then we're popped back to the beginning of the story with Sisko on the Defiant. He takes a beat, but then whirls around and dives into Jake, knocking him to the floor. The electrical charge flashes over their heads, missing them. And young Jake asks how he knew that was coming. And Sisko says, "I guess we were just lucky this time."
Oh, nice.
And Jake asks if he's okay. And he says, "I am now." And he hugs Jake tightly, crying. Cry number 10 million. I mean, I cried through this entire episode. Even the second time I watched it. And then when writing my notes. And then when editing my notes.
It's that kind of episode.
What horrible person has decided to torture me like this?
It's the second time then when Sisko says, "I am now Jake."
And he's crying.
Yeah, and the way Avery's voice breaks when he's saying that killed me.
I know.
I remember at the time watching that and was like, oh my God.
Unbelievable. Well, the end. No biggie.
Awesome closing shots of the Defiant to kind of make up for torturing me for the last 44 minutes.
I'm sure that's what they were going for. So do you have some over-analysis?
I have a few bits and pieces. I think the first one is really an observation. This must be extremely traumatizing for Sisko.
Yeah.
He's only aware of being in subspace for a few minutes at a time, and each time he comes back, Jake is older, and later is obsessing about him and riddled with guilt. And then in the final return, Jake's prepared to sacrifice his life to save his dad. Sisko must remember all of this.
He must. I have that in my overanalysis notes as well, that I just feel for him having to watch his son's life vanish before his eyes in just minutes.
Yeah.
And to be left with the burden of knowing what his death would do to his kid.
Right.
I mean, you're in a dangerous job. This must make him second guess everything about how he is raising Jake, even though we know he's the perfect dad.
Yeah.
But oh my God, that to me is the tragedy of the story.
Yeah, because you can see what your death could end up doing to your kid.
Yep.
Wow.
Ugh.
I think the next point is, and this is where it gets dark.
Oh. Darker.
This is
Yeah.
also a story of negative obsession and guilt, of how obsession will ultimately destroy you.
Except it didn't.
It did destroy the other Jake.
It destroyed the other Jake in the other timeline. Yep. Destroy is a tough word. It definitely diminished him.
Yeah.
I don't know that it destroyed him. It took away the family he could have had. And that's a bummer.
Right.
But he continued to live a life. And in the end, he actually was writing again.
Yeah.
So he was sort of coming back to that. But he had long periods of time where his obsession took him away from that family he could have built.
Yeah, and clearly negatively impacted his life.
But how could you not get sucked into that when you know he's alive? How could you give it up?
And that leads on to my follow-up point, which is this is also a story about sacrificing everything for the one you love.
True. And not even for someone that you love romantically.
Yes.
Just someone that you just love.
The sacrifice in this, the future Jake won't see the benefit of his actions.
Nope.
It's kind of strange, really, because the past Jake won't really know the actions that he made in the future. Well, unless his dad tells him.
Yeah, I don't know if his dad would tell him. Maybe not. But I do think he needs to work a little bit harder to make sure that Jake does do that thing of looking up every now and then and living his life.
Next thing, and we're getting a little bit into legalese here.
Okay.
Weren't Jake's actions a violation of the Temporal Prime Directive?
He didn't go back in time.
He actually caused Sisko to go back in time.
No. Sisko was stuck outside of time.
Ah.
There's the loophole.
He had progressed several minutes from the accident.
Maybe. There's no evidence of that.
I claim the fact that Sisko was aware that he should duck and Jake told him in the future means that Jake is personally responsible for a new timeline in which Sisko survived and violated the Temporal Prime Directive.
Where's this Temporal Prime Directive of which you speak? Where did that come from?
I thought that one came from TNG.
Okay, maybe you're right. But he's not in Starfleet. Aha!
Well,
Jake is not in Starfleet.
Okay, the older Jake then.
No Jake is in Starfleet. I just wrote down that he went back to school to study subspace mechanics.
Okay, I might accept that.
I mean, he's wearing a badge, but it might just be a communicator. But anyway, yeah, I don't think he was time traveling. I think he found a loophole. He was just going to set his dad free.
I'm skeptical, but I'm willing to take that as an answer.
Okay.
That's a good one.
That's good.
Although that does lead on to there would be a whole different canon.
Well, that's really what Star Trek, the Kelvin universe did. I remember when we walked out of that movie, I was like, oh my God, they just changed everything.
But because it's Star Trek,
Yeah.
somebody could go back in time and boom, everything's back to as it was.
Remember in Parallels,
Yeah.
This was in season 7 of TNG.
Great
We
episode.
find out there's a bunch of different versions of reality going
Yeah.
on. There's a multiverse, so to speak.
Certainly for Worf.
Right. So this timeline probably continues just fine.
Ah.
And a different timeline either springs up or that other timeline just changes. It's a multiverse problem.
Or it could be like my theory for Visionary, where Miles wasn't actually time traveling, he was just jumping to different alternatives.
Yeah. So this is an opportunity for many people to write many books.
Good point.
Although I don't want to read the book where Sisko's not alive.
No.
I don't want to read that book.
Not doing it.
I had enough of that in this episode.
You know, that makes me wonder about Melanie. Would she disappear? Would she get to read the stories?
I think so, because I feel like that timeline continues elsewhere.
Ooh. Okay, that's good. I was worried about Melanie not getting to read them.
Did you know that Melanie is played by Andrew Robinson's daughter?
Oh.
That is Garrick's daughter, essentially, in that
funny.
role. Rachel Robinson.
Next point.
Yeah.
The Dominion. With the Klingons blocking the wormhole,
Yep.
it kind of proves that the Dominion's actions are actually just in defense of their way of life. When you stop transit through the wormhole, they no longer felt threatened and didn't take offensive action in the Alpha Quadrant.
Yeah, they didn't care anymore.
So really, they're just defending themselves.
What does that female changeling say to Odo about the Alpha Quadrant?
She made the comment that it seemed chaotic.
Yeah, there's a lot of chaos for them to clean up. So they might still eventually come through, but remember, the founders live forever, so maybe they're just biding their time.
Playing the super long game.
Yeah, that was sort of interesting that they just dropped that. There were sort of mentions of it on the peripheries of the story, but it wasn't a big part of it because it didn't need to be. They needed to do something else.
Right. And on to my final points.
Okay.
Being brutally practical, didn't anyone think of asking the prophets? The emissary had been lost in subspace. This is a perfect opportunity for the prophets to help.
It would have made more sense if the Klingons had collapsed the wormhole, because then they would have lost access to the prophets.
Really?
And that would have just put an end to the threat of the Dominion. I think that's what they should have done as part of the story. Because I thought about that too, just what you said. Would the prophets not do anything about it? Of course, the other side of it is that the prophets see the outcome is fine.
Oh.
And Sisko does come back. So they don't care. They're like, meh, Jake will fix it and it'll be fine.
Well, leading on from this.
Yeah.
When Jake and Sisko were together in the subspace pocket,
yes.
Did that not look awfully like something the prophets would do?
Oh, yes, it did.
Was this ultimately something the prophets were actually doing? Were they testing Sisko? Or Jake? Were they conducting some kind of experiment on the corporeal beings? Or, and here's an idea, was this the Prophet's clumsy way of warning Sisko that Jake has this obsessive negative side that could ultimately destroy him? They were trying to do a good thing, but because they have so little understanding of how to deal with corporeal life forms, this is the result.
From what I know about the prophets or the wormhole aliens up till this point, they don't really seem capable of that kind of analysis of an individual. Yeah. I mean, I imagine they have some sort of extra interest in Sisko, which we've seen, but I still don't quite understand. We haven't really done much more with that yet. So maybe they would be examining him a little bit closer. This morning when you were saying you had a lot of analysis points and I asked you, was one of them that this never happened? What I meant was this. Where the prophets were playing some kind of a game, or they'd created some kind of a pocket in time, and that this really was happening to Sisko and not to Jake.
Oh.
And that it was something that only happened in his mind, those few moments where he was stuck in subspace. I did have that thought.
That's interesting. So maybe the prophets were conducting an experiment.
Maybe.
There are things that happen later in the canon of the show, which leads me in these directions.
I see. Okay.
But I won't go into detail.
Well, that's what yeah, when I say what I've seen of the prophets so far, I'm not sure it makes sense that they would do this or have the capability of doing this. Yeah. Okay. You always have to ask the question in science fiction in particular, did this really happen? Is that a dream?
Oh, that's true. Well, I think that wraps up my overanalysis of the saddest episode of Star Trek ever.
Absolutely the saddest episode of Star Trek that I have ever seen. And I have cried at some Star Trek episodes, but this one was the hardest. I still find it shocking that even after they knew Sisko was alive, after he appeared on the station and they all saw him, that they just gave up. I find that really hard to believe. I just wish they had shown that a little bit more. I think older Jake does say something about Miles and Dax tried for a while, but even if they had just showed it, just given me a little montage and then of them giving up something so that I believe that they did everything they could because they knew he was there and they knew he was alive. Would they really just move on with their lives? I don't see how Jake could. That would haunt me.
Well, the other side to that is if they knew he was there and Dax and O'Brien couldn't get him out, well, what about other people in Starfleet? Wouldn't this become
ask a few people.
novel thing to study for a postdoctorate student who would be trying to figure out how to get someone stuck in subspace?
That would have been great if they had done that. If there had been like whole studies done and they had created a whole line of study at Starfleet Academy. Yeah. Something. Show me that you tried.
Maybe this Jake worked with somebody or a group of people on this for decades.
Maybe. So old Jake, I mean, the poor guy, he was essentially tortured by this, for his whole life. And then for Sisko to see how much it tortured him must be devastating. And now he has to live with that. I mean...
But Sisko's in a position now, like I said, maybe the prophets were warning him because he can help Jake with the kind of things that he saw as a problem as an adult. The obsessive nature, his susceptibility to depression or guilt. Perhaps that could improve things.
Gosh, Jake has this opportunity to go to Pennington.
Right.
And he's put it off because he doesn't want his dad to be alone, basically. And we had that whole conversation back in that episode about being homesick. This is an example of where Sisko should really get Jake to go to that school because he's anchored to him in a different way. That anchor became a really negative thing in this story, but he's still the anchor. And maybe this is the lesson that he was being taught. If somebody was teaching him a lesson and it didn't really happen, maybe that's the lesson. Because from here, I would think it would be quite easy for Sisko to retreat and become risk averse because he doesn't want this to happen to his kid. Even, he's 18 years old, he's an adult, but he still doesn't want that to happen to him and he doesn't want his life to be ruined by it. So he could very easily retreat and keep the bond. But really what he should be doing is putting his kid in a boat and pushing him out into the water. So he should be insisting that Jake leave the station, that he go and start a life as an adult somewhere else, go to school, do whatever, go to Pennington, do something else to move him along.
Maybe that's the warning.
That's what I'm saying. That someone, if it was the prophets or whatever, was giving to Sisko.
Wow.
I think we cracked it.
Hey, I think that's a great explanation of it.
That's what I think. Well, I don't have any other overanalysis. I mean, I don't like crying that much. That was a lot. Let me talk a little bit about women in the future. I don't have a lot to say here, though. Why did Jake's wife leave him, especially after meeting Sisko? It's one thing if he'd never seen him for herself and then she had to just sort of believe in a thing, that she hadn't been a part of, but she saw him, she touched him, she knew it was real. And I didn't like that characterization of her. I do understand the need in the story for Sisko to see that he had lost his way, but would you really give up as the spouse?
I would say it depends. I think this is where the obsession side of Jake became really negative because I think she didn't leave. He excluded her.
They didn't show that, I guess, enough for me to buy it. But yeah, okay, that does make sense.
That was the way I saw it.
The other note I have in Women in the Future is Kira's uniform changed a bit here. I noticed the change to the collar. That was the first thing because it has a little bit of a slit at the collar at the top. And so I looked it up and I guess it also became a bit more red, which is hard to see with the quality of video at that time. And they reduced the shoulder pads a bit. It seemed like it became a bit more form-fitting. They took some of the bulk away. And I know you made a comment that she looked quite thin. And I've made that comment before that I thought she looked quite thin. But now that they've removed some of the padding, maybe it just became a little bit more evident. There was also something in the article I was reading that they added heels to her boots, which we don't see here. We don't ever see her feet, but that never makes sense to me. In a job of action for women, they only do that on TV or in movies. That doesn't happen in real life. But the uniform definitely seems to me a lot less bulky and it's probably more comfortable for her at this point, but it also feels a bit more like a tight catsuit. But the showrunners claim that was never the point, but who knows?
Well, she might have reached a point where her agent negotiated and she wants comfortable clothes.
Yeah, and if that's what happened, then that's great. It wasn't really that noticeable. It wasn't like some of the things that they did on a few of the other shows. It wasn't like 7 of 9's drastic outfit. That change wasn't that extreme.
Yeah, I read Michael Dorn actually negotiated a change in makeup because it was irritating his skin. Him having played a Klingon for all that time and all the prosthetics.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, let's go to rating. Thumbs up, thumbs down, or neutral. What is your rating?
Thumbs up, because this is one of my favorite Star Treks of all time.
Really hard not to love this episode. I mean, I don't know how heartless you have to be to give this episode a thumbs down or a neutral.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are people who don't like it. It reminded me a little bit of the Inner Light episode on Next Gen, which I didn't like. But it's similar in that it's, a bit outside of the normal continuity of the story.
Yeah.
This one, though, is better to me because it kept me in the Trek universe. The thing I didn't like about Inner Light, it was outside of Star Trek.
Yeah.
And it was a different story. But I get that it could have done a lot for the development of Picard, except for the fact that we were episodic. So it maybe could have had a different impact in something that was serialized. What's really interesting to me here is that this Star Trek episode was written by a guy named Michael Taylor. And this was the first Star Trek episode he wrote. It wasn't the last. He wrote a few others on DS9, but he also wrote several Voyager episodes. And then he went on later to be a writer on Battlestar Galactica.
Oh.
What a way to start with this.
Oh, absolutely. Even if you strip away the emotion, it's such a great classic storytelling method. The stranger in the night. The man obsessed with the one task, the story that needs to be told, and this is the one moment in time that I can tell it to someone. All these classic little storytelling tropes brought together. This is a great story arc. I loved it.
And also so interesting that it was a son for a father.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a romantic thing where the woman died and then the man was obsessed with getting her back. It wasn't that.
Yeah.
It was different, but it was still a love that we believed in.
Right.
If they had done this in season 1, forget it.
Yeah.
But they waited until that relationship was meaningful and believable. And then they did this to us.
Yes.
They did it on purpose, and it worked. Ugh, rude.
Yes, it was the right time that you could do an episode like that, and it would work, and it would be believable.
Yeah, totally. But all the thumbs up for me, just tremendous. I don't even know what else to say about it.
Yeah.
But please don't make me cry this much in any more Star Trek episodes because, the pandemic is hard enough. I don't need Star Trek to make me cry. I appreciate it every now and then to get me attached to it, but oh my goodness.
Yeah, this story is a true tearjerker.
Yeah.
This story slayed me 30 years ago.
Yeah, I can see why. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of season 4, episode 2. I almost feel like we should stop here because I don't know how we top this. But come back next week. We'll see what season 4, episode 3 has in store. It's so funny to me that as we record this, we're just releasing the episode 23 of last season, which is one of the worst things I've ever seen on Star Trek. And now, today, at the same exact time, we're recording about this episode. Maybe the greatest, definitely one of the greatest Star Trek episodes I've ever watched. So it's so funny how this show has the lowest lows and the highest highs.
Now you see why I love it.
Oh, but the lows stop dragging me down.
Good advice generally.
It's tough for me to say it's the greatest ever, as Best of Both Worlds, when it originally aired, was so meaningful to me. I loved it so much. Also cried, by the way.
Yes. Well, for me, this is a show that it's impactful 30 years later.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, that really wraps it up. So in the meantime, if you'd like to send us your own overanalysis of this episode or of any episode, or if you just want to say something nice, please email us at rebingeit@gmail.com or tweet us at rebingeit. You can also check us out on talkthroughmedia.com, where you can leave feedback for individual episodes, and you can also listen to the other podcasts on our network, including the Star Trek Lower Deck podcast that's going on right now.
Thanks for joining us on the Rebinge Deep Space Nine podcast.
That's it for me.
And that's it from me.